The first thing you will need to do is gather your tools. First, and most importantly, you will need a grounding strap. Static electricity can easily damage computer chips. It only takes a minimal amount of volts to ruin a chip, so this inexpensive, easy-to-use device is well worth the investment. To properly ensure a good ground, click the ground strap clip onto your case. Before you work on the case, make sure you unplug the power supply from the wall outlet. You will also need a Phillips head screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, a 3/16 nut driver, and a 1/4-inch nut driver, and some tweezers. We'll begin with the case. To remove the case from its package, simply open the top. Keeping the flaps open, turn the case upside down. Holding both sides, lift the package up and away from the case. Remove the foam packaging protectors and plastic. Now we are ready to remove the side cover. Take the side cover off. And take the package of miscellaneous hardware out of the case. In this package, you will find the motherboard mounting guides and mounting screws. Some higher-end cases will have drive rails like shown here. We'll just set these aside for now. Next, remove the front cover plate for the front drive bays. Not all cases will have a removable front cover. Remove the cover plates from the drives you are installing. If you have a typical case as shown here, simply remove the cover plates like so. First, we will install the Sound Blaster audio deck, which is part of the sound card. Not all sound cards will have a front module as shown here. First, remove the audio deck from its package. This case has slide mount guides which allow the drives to be removed easily. If your case does not have these, simply line it up in the slot and attach it with 2 screws on each side. We will attach the slide mount guides onto the audio deck. Next, we'll plug in the data and audio cable. Now we're ready to slide the deck into position. Next, we will install the DVD-ROM drive. We'll remove the DVD-ROM drive from its package that it was shipped in. Before placing the drive into the case, make sure the settings are correct. Before we look at the DVD-ROM settings, it's important to understand several terms regarding jumpers. There are 2 types of terminations discussed when dealing with jumpers. The first term is open, shown on these pins here. Here, no jumper has been placed, which means no connection is made, and this means open. Next is closed or short, which means that 2 pins are connected together with the jumper. These 2 pins are therefore jumpered, closed, or shorted. Now we'll check our settings on the DVD-ROM. There are several settings you can use here. Primary is used when the DVD-ROM is the only drive on the IDE connection on the motherboard, or you have another device used on the same channel and the other device is set as slave or secondary. Secondary is used when the DVD-ROM drive is chained together on the same IDE cable with another DVD-ROM drive or hard drive. A quick note, it is not recommended to place a DVD-ROM drive on the same IDE cable as your primary hard drive. We also have custom, which is rarely used. This would be used on a non-standard setup. Before you install the drive, make sure you identify the number 1 pin on the 40-pin connector. Look for the one labeled on the drive. Generally, it's right next to the power connector. Mount the slide mount guides and slide the DVD-ROM drive right into the bay here. If your case does not have the slide mount guides, then simply slide the drive in as shown here and secure it on both sides with the mounting screws. Attach the power connector to the drive. You'll find that the power connector only goes in one way, so you can't plug it in the wrong way. Attach the 40-pin ribbon to the drive. Here you will see the ribbon has a stripe on one side. This lines up to the number 1 noted earlier. Now we will attach the audio cable to the DVD-ROM drive. Now we're ready to install the floppy drive. We'll remove the floppy drive from its package. Next, mount the slide mount guides and slide the floppy into place. Now, connect the power cable to the floppy drive. Identify the number 1 on the floppy drive. Typically, it is right next to the power supply. Connect the 34-pin ribbon to the drive, lining up the stripe on the ribbon to the number 1 pin. Now we're ready to install the hard drive. We'll remove the hard drive from its package. On the back of the drive, you will find a jumper, which must be set correctly when you install the drive. On the top of most Western Digital drives, you will find a schematic diagram which shows how to place jumpers for the desired settings. Set the drive for a standalone master if this will be the only hard drive on your computer. If you have multiple hard drives, you will need to select Primary Master or Primary Slave if you use these drives on the same IDE cable. Typically, new hard drives are set as standalone masters when they are shipped, so you shouldn't have to make any changes if you are using only one drive, but check it out to make sure. Identify the number 1 on the IDE connector if the drive is an IDE drive. Connect the 40-pin ribbon, again making sure you line up the stripe with the number 1. If we are installing a serial ATA drive, then let's review several factors before we install the drive. Serial ATA drives will have a serial ATA power connector as well as the 4-pin Molex Legacy Power Connector. Legacy Power is included for systems that do not have the serial ATA power connector. You can buy a serial ATA power connector adapter, which will convert the serial ATA power connector to the Legacy ATA 4-pin Molex connector. The advantage of serial ATA power connectors is that you may unplug and plug in the drive while the system is on. This is known as hot plugging or swapping. When plugging in the serial ATA power connector, you will find the connector is shaped like an L, which allows you to only plug in only one way. Next, you will have a data cable. The data cable is also shaped as an L, but it is smaller then the serial ATA power connector, which allows you to easily identify the plug between the power connector. Make sure the data cable does not exceed 39 inches. Finally, what is the jumper block used for? Since earlier we noted that serial ATA drives are jumperless. The only use of this jumper block is to enable or disable power management for the drive. Serial ATA drives are shipped by default in the disabled mode, which is the recommended choice. Start by connecting the serial ATA data cable in here. Next, plug in the power connector if you are using a Molex to serial ATA adapter, and mount the slide mount guides and slide the hard drive into place. If your system has a serial ATA power connector, go ahead and plug it in now. Now we're ready to install the motherboard and CPU. We will open the box and remove the manual that it was shipped in with the motherboard. Read through the entire manual before you begin installation. Before you touch the motherboard, make sure you ground yourself with the wrist strap. If you don't, you can easily ruin your brand new chipset with static electricity. Remove the motherboard from its static wrapper and place it on a static wrapper it was shipped in. Now we want to make sure the onboard BIOS flash jumper is closed. Many motherboards are shipped with the jumper in the open position to save battery life. The motherboard was shipped closed by default, so no change is necessary. Now we are ready to install the RAM. Installing RAM is very easy. Check the motherboard manual prior to installing for the configuration of which DIMM slot to use. If you are using one memory stick, then you can simply line it up and plug it in to DIMM 1. Using 2 shows DIMM 1 and 3, which are the blue slots on this motherboard. You will find that the RAM only goes in one way. Hold the two edges of the DIMM module carefully and try not to touch the copper pins. Align the notch on the module with the rib on the DIMM slot. Firmly press the module into the slot until the ejector tabs at both sides of the slot automatically snap into the mounting notch. Do not force the DIMM module in with extra force, as the module will only fit in one way. To remove a module for repair or upgrade, simply push the two ejector tabs on the slot outward simultaneously and then pull the module out. Now we'll mount the CPU. Whether you are installing an Intel or AMD, you'll find the chip plugs in to the socket only one way. Take a look at your CPU and you will find a notch, which will only allow the CPU to be plugged in to the socket one way. Do not touch the pins on the CPU. Pull the socket locking lever slightly and then lift it up. Simply line up the notch on the CPU and match it to the motherboard socket and carefully plug it in like so. Lower the locking lever to the fully locked position. Next, mount the CPU fan Apply thermal interface material in the middle of the CPU or fan if the fan does not already have it located on the middle of the fan. When you buy a new fan, the thermal material is usually provided on the fan surface already. Next, connect the power plug for the CPU fan to the motherboard. Now we'll mount the motherboard into the case. Hold the motherboard up to the back plate so you can see where the motherboard mounts need to be fastened. Count all the motherboard standoffs that are on the back plate and ensure that you have utilized all of those standoffs. You don't want a standoff touching the circuit on the back of the motherboard. When you turn it on, you see sparks. Mount the motherboard to the back plate and fasten the screws to the standoff. Next, connect the power supply to the motherboard. First, connect the 12-volt ATX power supply, followed by the 24-pin connector. The power supply connector will only go in one way, so we will simply plug it in here. Now we'll connect all the peripherals to the motherboard. First, check that all your power connectors are properly connected. This will include the sound deck, DVD-ROM drive, floppy drive, and hard drive. Next, you will want to connect the IDE and serial ATA cables to the motherboard. Let's start with the DVD-ROM. Plug the 40-pin IDE cable from the DVD-ROM drive to the motherboard, labeled secondary IDE. Again, line up pin 1 on the motherboard with the stripe on the cable to ensure proper installation. Next, plug in the hard drive. Plug the IDE cable from the hard drive to the motherboard, labeled primary master or IDE 1. Like the DVD-ROM drive, the 40-pin IDE ribbon has a stripe which lines up to the one labeled on the motherboard. If you are installing a serial ATA, then plug the serial ATA connector into the serial ATA slot for standard installation. If your case has external connections, then you will want to connect these now. Typical items usually will include 1394 connections, COM port connections, and USB connections, and also serial ATA connections. We will start by plugging in the external 1394 connections, followed by the USB connections. These connectors are usually keyed so they will only plug in one way. You should always verify the pins with your motherboard before making any connections. Now we're ready to plug in the cards. First, review the motherboard guide on the IRQs used on each slot. This will allow you to place your cards in the slots that won't conflict with each other. Let's look at column A, PCI Express LAN, PCI Express X16 slot E1, PCI slot 1, and the IEE 1394 controller are all sharing the same IRQ channel. You will not want to place two devices that transfer a lot of data on the same channel. An example may be a video editing card used in PCI slot 1. The video card may have to process the data which is retrieved from a video camera using a 1394 connection to send the data to the computer. This may or may not conflict with each other. If you find the computer becomes unstable after building and running it for a while, you can always switch your cards around until your PC becomes more stable. We'll start with the video card. If you are installing a PCI Express card, then you will install it into the PCI Express slot. If you chose a motherboard with A-gap support, then you will plug in the A-gap video card into the A-gap slot as shown on this motherboard. If you chose a PCI video card, this will plug into one of the PCI slots here. You should plug the card into the slot closest to the power supply. If you find there is a conflict after you attempt to boot the PC, you can resolve this by simply moving the card into a different slot. Simply slide the card into the slot.
Okay.
Make sure you press firmly and verify the card is fully seated. You should not see any copper pins showing on the card if the card is properly seated. Next, plug in the power connector to the video card. This is common with higher end cards as they require additional power for processor and cooling requirements. Now we'll install the sound card. If you have a PCI sound card, place it in the last slot, which is PCI 3 shown here on this motherboard. Before we insert the sound card, let's plug in the 40-pin data cable from the audio deck. When you plug in the card, make sure it fully seats into the slot. Then connect the audio cable from the DVD-ROM to the sound card, and the audio cable connects right here. And now install the modem or network card. If your motherboard does not have onboard support, plug it in to slot PCI 1 or PCI 2. Make sure the card seats completely in the slot. Now install the Ethernet card if you plan on installing one. If you have a PCI card, plug it into the slot that does not conflict any other cards. Make sure the card is completely seated in the slot. Next, we need to plug in the LED and power switch connectors. Some cases will have a speaker used for motherboard alarms. This case does not have one. We will start by plugging in the reset switch. It will plug into the pins shown here in the motherboard manual labeled reset switch. The polarity on the reset switch will not matter as it is simply a momentary contactor. Next is the 4-pin connector labeled speaker. If your case had a connector, then you will plug it in to the 4 pins labeled speaker. Here you will want to make sure you line up the red pin with the positive and the black pin with the negative as shown in the manual. Next, you will find a power LED connector. This will display a LED light found on the front of the case, which will indicate that power is on. This will plug in to the pins labeled power LED. Line the red or green wire to the positive and the white to the negative. Here, the positive is pin 2 and the negative is pin 6. Next, you will want to find the IDE LED connector, which should be for 2 pins. The white will go on the negative side and the colored wire, usually red, will go on the positive side shown here on pins 1 and 2. Finally, we will plug in the 2-pin power switch connector labeled power switch. This connector is for the system power button. Pressing the power button turns the system on or puts the system in sleep or soft off mode depending on the BIOS setting you choose. Pressing the power button for more than 4 seconds while the system is on turns the system off. You will plug this in to the pins labeled power switch shown on pins 11 and 13. Now you will want to make sure all the cables are plugged in and all the peripherals are mounted. Then make sure the cables are tucked neatly in the case so that none will get pinched or cut when replacing the cover. You can use zip ties to secure the cables securely. It is also important that you keep the CPU fan clear so you don't block airflow. You also don't want a cable touching the CPU fan, causing it not to spin. A common mistake is after placing the case cover back on and moving it into your office, you turn it on, and after a little while your PC shuts down, or worse, you smell smoke. Before we place the cover back on, we need to walk through the pre-startup checkoff list. The pre-startup checkoff list can be found on our website at www.c2learn.com/updates, as well as the bonus CD included. Review the motherboard, ensuring that all the screws are fastened properly and no screws or other objects are on or around the motherboard. Check the CPU and fan, ensuring that the fan is secured and clear from any objects. Also, make sure the fan power plug is properly installed. Next, make sure the memory modules are fully seated. Review all the cards and adapters, ensuring that they are plugged in and fully seated. Also, review the LED connectors one more time and ensure they are still plugged in properly. Once you have double-checked everything, you are now ready to place the cover back on. Fasten it with the mounting screws. And finally, let's review the back plate for connections. Plug the 110-volt power cord in here. Also, look and verify the switch settings are at 120 volt and not 240 volt. The monitor will plug into the video card's DVI connectors shown here. The mouse will plug into the USB port shown here, and the keyboard here. If you installed a modem, you will plug the RJ11 phone jack into the modem labeled line in. And finally, the speakers will plug into the sound card line in. Now that all the components are installed, we're ready to boot up the computer for the first time. In part 3, you'll learn how to boot up your new computer, how to access the BIOS menu, and how to configure the BIOS. Many of the options in the BIOS menu are intended for advanced users and will not need to be changed. What you will see in this video is an overview of the various options with an emphasis on the options that may need to be changed. The BIOS is a program located on the ROM chip located on the motherboard shown here. The BIOS is built-in software that determines what a computer can do without accessing programs from a disk. On PCs, the BIOS contains all the code required to control the keyboard, display screen, disk drives, serial communications, and a number of miscellaneous functions. Most motherboards have a flash BIOS, which means that the data is written on a flash memory chip, which allows you to update the BIOS information if necessary. So the first thing you need to do is turn the computer on. To access the BIOS screen, you'll need to press the delete key right away. Otherwise, the system will boot and you will see this. This program is known as the boot screen. Boot, which is short for boot up, refers to the starting of a computer and mainly involves loading the operating system and other basic performing system checks. During the boot up process, you can press pause on your keyboard to pause and read the content. If you press delete right after you turn the computer on, you'll see this screen, which is the BIOS setup screen. Not all systems have the same setup. While the basic look and function of the setup program remains the same for all systems, the appearance of your setup screen may differ from the screen shown here. We will start with the main BIOS screen. Before starting, note the keys you use to select and change options. Most BIOS screens will give you a list of keyboard functions to navigate through the BIOS screen here on the right-hand side. Use the Enter key to select a field that is highlighted. To navigate right through the fields, use the Tab key. To navigate left through the fields, use the Shift Tab key. Use the plus or minus to change the field. Use the arrow right and left key to select a screen. Use the arrow up and down to select an item. And press F1 for general help. And finally, the Escape button will allow you to exit and quit the setup screen that you are currently on. Pressing F10 will exit the BIOS screen, allowing you to save changes or exit without saving changes. In the BIOS setup screen menu, you will see several setup options. Most of the settings are already set properly by default, so you'll go through and look over the settings and focus on the ones that might need to be changed. This is the main CMOS menu, which is an overview of the basic system information. Here you can set the time and system date. Next, Legacy Diskette, which sets the type of floppy drive installed. If you did not install floppy, then you can disable that here. Next, the BIOS language settings. Next is IDE settings. Here you will see the IDE settings that are detected. These values are not user configurable. If no drive is detected, then you will see Not Detected as shown here. To view the settings, simply select the drive to view. Leave the Editable selection to Auto, which is the recommended choice and the default selection. Press Escape to return to the previous menu. Next is IDE configuration, which allows you to set or change the configurations for the IDE and serial ATA devices installed in the system. Select an item, then press Enter if you want to configure the item. You can enable or disable the serial ATA 1 or 2 setting, as well as the NVIDIA RAID function and serial ATA 1 and 2 controller. Enabling the serial ATA controller or RAID function allows you to set parameters. Last is system information, which is an overview of the general system specifications. The BIOS automatically detects items in this menu and displays the information here. Press the Escape button to return to the main menu and arrow over to Advanced. The Advanced menu allows you to change the settings for the CPU and other system devices. LAN cable status displays the status of the local area network cable connected to the LAN port. Post-check LAN cable allows you to enable or disable LAN cable checks during post. When enabled, the menu reports the cable faults or shorts and displays the point where the fault or short is detected. Press Escape. AMD Cool and Quiet configuration allows you to enable the AMD Cool and Quiet feature. Jumper-free configurations allows you to configure the system frequency and voltage. There are also preset overclocking configuration options as shown here. Remember that overclocking can damage your CPU, so it is recommended you leave the settings as they are. All of these settings should be left as default. Next is CPU configuration. This will display the CPU information that the BIOS automatically detects. These settings will not need to be changed and should be left in their default value. Next is chipset settings. These settings here should be left as default and do not need to be changed. Primary graphics adapter allows you to change the primary adapter used when using two adapters. The default setting is the preferred choice for standard setup installation. Next is onboard device configuration. Here you can enable or disable any devices you have that are going to be used. Serial port address should be left as default unless you have a conflict with the IRQ settings. Parallel port can be disabled if you are not using the parallel port, or you can change the address from 378 to 278 if you encounter a conflict. The default and recommended value is 378. Next is parallel port mode. This should be left in the default value. Next is onboard game port, which by default is enabled. This does not need to be changed. Next is onboard MIDI port, which is set at 330 and does not need to be changed. Next is 1394, which by default is enabled. If you do not plan on using a 1394 device, then you can disable this here. Silicon image mode allows you to set serial ATA2 mode, RAID mode, or disabled. Select the mode you will be using. Since we will not be using the RAID mode, we'll use the serial ATA2 mode. Here again, you can disable this feature if you do not plan on using the RAID controller. Next is onboard LAN 1 and 2. You can disable LAN 2 if you plan on using only one port. Next is onboard AC97 audio, which is the onboard sound device. If you plan on installing a sound card, then go ahead and disable this here. Next is PCI PNP settings. If you set these settings incorrectly, your system can malfunction. It is recommended you leave these settings at their default state. Next is USB configuration. By default, these settings are enabled. These should be enabled as you will find you will need as many USB devices as available. Press Escape and arrow over to Power. The Power menu is for setting ACPI and advanced power management features. Suspend mode, which is auto by default, allows you to select the advanced configuration and power interface state to be used for system suspend. Setting this item to auto allows the operating system to select the ACPI state. Auto is the recommended selection. Next, repost video on S3 resume. No is the default and recommended value. This will determine whether to invoke VGA BIOS post on S3 STR resume. Default setting is recommended. Next is ACPI support, which by default is enabled. This will allow you to enable or disable the advanced configuration and power interface support in the Advanced Programmable Interrupt Controller. When this is enabled, the ACPI table pointer is included in the RSDT pointer list. Enabled is the default and recommended settings. Next is APM configuration, which stands for Advanced Power Management Configuration. Most options should be set to disabled, which are their default settings. The restore on AC power loss, which is power off by default, allows the computer to remain in the off position during a power failure. If you set this to power on, the system will start up during power restore. Next is hardware monitor. This will display the CPU and motherboard temperatures, as well as CPU fan speed and voltage readings. Press Escape and arrow over to Boot. The boot settings will allow you to change the boot options. Let's start with boot device priorities. Here you can select the first, second, and third boot sequence. Recommended settings are hard drive for the first boot, CD/DVD for the second, and third disabled. If you are loading an operating system for the first time, then you will set the first boot priority as CD/DVD and hard drive as second. We will set the first boot to CD/DVD since we are getting ready to load an operating system. After you have loaded an operating system, it is recommended to come back here and change the settings back to hard drive as first, boot, and CD/DVD as second boot. Next is the boot setup utility. Here you'll have the boot settings. Quick boot, which is enabled by default, allows the BIOS to skip some power on self-tests called post while booting. This will decrease the time needed to boot the system. Leave this enabled. Next is full logo display, which displays the logo during boot up. You can disable this if you do not want to see the motherboard logo during boot up. This is a personal choice. Add-on ROM display mode, which by default is Force BIOS, and this is the recommended choice. Next is boot up numlock, on which by default is on. This is a personal choice, but on is recommended. This will turn the numlock on, so you will have numeric functions on your keyboard after boot up. Wait for F1 if error enabled. This is handy when an error is detected. It will prompt you to press F1 key. Enabling this is the preferred choice in the default settings. Next is Hit Delete Message display, which by default is enabled. This displays the message "Press Delete" to run setup during post. Leave this enabled by default. Interrupt should be left in the disabled mode, which is the default settings. Next is security. The security menu items allow you to change the system security settings. Select this item to set or change the supervisor password. The supervisor item on top of the screen shows the default not installed. After you set a password, this item shows installed. To set a supervisor password, select the Change Supervisor Password item, then press Enter. From the password box, type a password composed of at least 6 letters and/or numbers, then press Enter. Confirm the password when prompted. The message "Password installed" appears after you have successfully set your password. To change the user password, follow the same steps as in setting a supervisor password. To clear the password, select the Change Supervisor Password, then press Enter. The message "Password uninstalled" appears. If you forgot the password, you can clear it by erasing the CMOS real-time clock. To erase the RTC RAM, turn off the computer and unplug the power cord. Remove the onboard battery and move the jumper caps from pins 1 and 2 by default to pins 2 and 3. Keep the cap on pins 2 and 3 about 5 to 10 seconds, then go ahead and move the cap back to pins 1 and 2. Reinstall the battery, and then plug the power cord and turn on the computer. Hold down the Delete key during the boot process and enter the BIOS. You will need to reset and re-enter all changes that are not set as default in the BIOS menu. Finally, you have Exit. Here you will have several options. If you were unsure of the settings you changed, you can always select Load Setup Default here. If you did not want to save your settings, you can discard them by selecting this here. Then go back and re-enter or change the desired options. If you did not want to save and want to exit, then select Discard, Changes, and Exit here. Once you have made all the necessary changes and are happy with your selection, you will want to select Save Changes and Exit, and press Enter. If you find your system does not boot after you have made changes and are unable to access the BIOS, you will simply need to erase the RTC or real-time clock as discussed earlier. This will put you back to the beginning, which will require a few changes, which is mainly setting the boot priority, time and date settings, as well as any hardware you wish to disable or enable, like onboard audio. That concludes Part 3, BIOS Setup.